Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember to support, please subscribe. The Unjust Execution of Anne Boleyn. On the 19th of May 1536, just 4 days after the trial where Anne was convicted of adultery, incest and treason, she was condemned to die. It took just 17 days from her arrest for her to be put to death. She went from queen to outcast. But will Anne get her last-minute reprieve? At 2 a.m. on the 19th of May, the yeoman warders are patrolling the Tower of London, and inside Anne's apartments, nobody is asleep. It is said that Anne was surprising in her behaviour. She was almost cheery and laughing with her ladies. The constable of the Tower described Anne's mood as swinging between despair and hope. I have seen many men and also women executed, and all they have been in great sorrow. To my knowledge, this lady has much joy and pleasure in death. Does Anne still think that Henry will save her, or has she accepted her fate? Just 3 years ago, Anne's marriage had been arranged by Thomas Cromwell, but Anne, however, had failed to give Henry a son, and Anne and Cromwell were at loggerheads. Thomas Cromwell now needs Anne out of the way. All 5 men that were accused with Anne were executed on Tower Hill. Anne, however, is to now be the first person to be officially executed in a private execution in the Tower. So a scaffold needed building, and quickly. But why was there such a rush? The answer to that is Cromwell. He didn't want to give the king a chance to change his mind. In just hours he hoped to be rid of Anne. She had failed to give him a son, and he needed a male heir to continue the Tudor dynasty. Henry now had his eyes set on Jane Seymour. Jane was Anne's former lady-in-waiting, and she was next in line. She would replace her and give the king a new hope. And Cromwell is the mastermind behind it all. His next challenge was to ensure that Anne's daughter Elizabeth will never be queen. Henry also felt that a divorce would not suffice, and Cromwell needed to make sure that the marriage was annulled. Therefore, nothing could get in the way of a future male heir. 3 days previous, Cromwell had persuaded Cramner, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to write off the marriage. Cramner said, "On the basis of some true, just and legitimate causes recently brought to our attention, the marriage was now void, and has always been so, which makes Anne's daughter, henceforth as we know Elizabeth, a bastard." This is another blow for the devastated Anne. Her legacy is destroyed, and Elizabeth now has no chance to claim the throne. But Thomas Cramner was a firm supporter of Anne, as he was her personal confessor. If she had done anything wrong, she would have confessed, as she was deeply religious, and although he annulled the marriage, he is astounded at the charges. He is shocked and distraught. Cramner even told Henry that he was amazed, for he never had a better opinion of women. Cramner desperately hoped that the king would change his mind. But then Alexandra Alice, a close friend, arrived by boat to Cramner in an agitated state. He said he had had a nightmare, and he told Cramner in much detail. "It was revealed to me, whether I was asleep or awake, I know not. The queen's neck after her head had been cut off, and this so plainly that I could count the nerves, veins, and the arteries." Cramner saw this as a premonition, and he looked up to the sky and declared, "She who has been the Queen of England will today become a queen in heaven." Cramner is then utterly overcome with grief, and time is running out, and Anne is now just 6 hours from execution. At dawn, Anne was in her apartments, and she is with her chaplain receiving her final communion. But something you may not know is that this is a repeat of what happened the day before, when Anne was supposed to be executed. It had been postponed not once, but twice. One theory is that Cromwell was worried that there would be protests at the Tower in support of Anne. People began to mutter against the guilty verdict, and Cromwell needed time to have them removed from the Tower before the execution. Anne must have felt mentally tortured. It is said that hope is harder to deal with than despair. I can only imagine that Anne still had feelings that the king would change his mind and save her. Come 5 a.m. and Anne is still in her apartments, and she was preparing to face the world for the last time. Her ladies-in-waiting are distraught as they assist Anne with getting dressed. Anne had carefully selected each item of her clothing to send a message to those watching her execution. She wore a red kirtle, or underdress if you like. Wearing a red underdress or petticoat was normal for those of the lower class, and it is thought that Anne wore red to appear humble. Anne was educated in France, and her French flamboyant and colourfully rich clothing is something that she was famed for, but Anne chose a much more subdued outer gown. She wore black and grey, the colours of piety and sobriety. It is thought that Anne was trying to come across as meek, something that she was not known to be. Historians believe that by Anne dressing down, she was using the last of her armoury to try and get out of the situation and save herself from death. Anne had been convicted of treason, which is punishable by death, but the jury did not mention the method of execution. You see, a Queen of England had never before been sentenced to death, so this was new territory. In the National Archives lies a document that provides an insight into how the decision was made. In this 500-year-old book is a record of the execution warrant for Anne Boleyn, and this warrant sets out how she was to die. A woman under the Treason Act would have been burned, and a man would have been hung, drawn and quartered. But the document reveals that for Anne, Henry had chosen an alternative method of execution. We, moved by pity, not wishing the Lady Anne to be burned, direct the constable of the Tower that on the green within the Tower of London the said Anne shall have her head cut from her body. Henry then ordered a sword instead of an axe, because a blunt axe could take multiple blows to decapitate a person, and a sword was swift. However, when Anne is informed of Henry's decision, she shows her dark sense of humour. Anne puts her hands around her neck and says, "It will be a swift death, for I have just a little neck." The instructions for Anne's execution were sent to the Tower just the day before, and this gave the constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, little time to prepare. The document shows the unprecedented nature of it all, for Anne Boleyn was the first Queen of England to be executed, and they needed to get it right. But this document also left an instruction manual for any future wife of Henry VIII. Beheading by sword is actually a French method of execution. Henry summoned an expert swordsman from Saint-Omer in France. The swordsman had been at the Tower just 24 hours previous, and he would shortly have the daunting task of being the first man to execute an English queen. However, what is interesting is the time frames. It would have taken at least 3 days to travel from London to Dover, across the sea to Calais, and then a bit further to Saint-Omer, and then it would have taken a further 3 days for the swordsman to travel back. That's a minimum of 6 days. What this means is that the swordsman must have been summoned before the trial had reached a verdict, just 5 days previous. No matter what Anne said or did, her fate had been sealed. Anne's execution was meant to be a private affair, to preserve her modesty and dignity, and B, prevent anyone from rescuing her. Therefore, the public were ordered to leave the tower, but unfortunately the gates had been accidentally left unlocked and crowds were gathering in the anticipation of the execution. A question I find myself asking is, why would a person come to watch another person's execution? I put this down to society's fascination with the grim and morbid aspects of the world. Anne's uncle was present, as was the king's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. Was Fitzroy there to remind Anne that Henry was in fact able to father a son? Then the architect, Thomas Cromwell, appeared. He was about to witness the concluding part of his plan, and everything was now in place for the execution of Anne Boleyn. Sir William Kingston then headed to the Queen's apartments to summon Anne, and her time was running out. Anne is dressed and waiting to be called. The Constable of the Tower is responsible for making sure that Anne's execution goes to plan, and with the time approaching, he headed over to collect her. When Kingston arrives at Anne's door, I can only imagine what Anne must have been feeling. On one hand, it's what she has been dreading all along. Perhaps she is still hoping that against the odds, Kingston has come with a message from Henry to say that he has come to his senses and she will be saved. But those hopes are soon shattered, because Kingston then told her to make ready for her execution. Anne replied calmly, "Acquit yourself of your charge, for I have long been prepared." Anne was so extraordinarily ready to meet her fate, and it is certainly a testament to her character. Ambassador Chapuys remarked that Anne was braver than a lion. Words never more true than on the last day of her life. Henry, however, was at his palace in Whitehall, and there was no sign that he would change his mind. He had been dressed by his gentlemen, and was listening out for the firing of cannons, a signal that Anne was dead and he was free to remarry. Anne was then led by Sir William Kingston from the sanctuary of her apartments and through Cold Harbour Gate, and then onto the scaffold on the other side of the White Tower, where she was to be executed. Anne was accompanied by her 4 ladies in waiting. Anne's story had come full circle, for the last time she was here was just 3 years ago for her coronation. Anne was then met by a procession of 200 yeomen of the King's Guard, followed by the officers of the Tower and her chaplain. She is then escorted around the corner to the scaffold, which she then sees for the first time. The crowd is silent as she walks through them, and people then comment that she has never looked more beautiful. With time running out, Anne is looking around, hoping for a royal pardon, but it does not come. Anne then spots familiar faces in the crowds of the men who raised her to become queen. Her uncle and Thomas Cromwell, there to witness the destruction of her power and influence. Kingston then helps Anne up the steps to the scaffold, and she then turns to her ladies who are sobbing, and she comforts them. Anne then sees the executioner. He looks apprehensive at what he is about to do, but Anne does not see the sword, for it is hidden beneath the straw on the scaffold, and this was done as not to alarm her. Anne then asks Kingston for permission to speak. It is said that Anne did not look like someone who was about to be executed. Witnesses said that she was smiling, and then with a cheerful countenance she turned and addressed the crowds. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I come hither to accuse no man, nor speak anything of that whereof I am accused, and condemned to die. But I pray God save the King, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world, and of you all. And I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I condemn my soul." As Anne spoke, her words reduced many in the crowd to tears. It is believed that Anne's words were to try and get the king to look kindly on those she left behind, especially their daughter, Elizabeth. Anne was then invited to confess the truth, but Anne replied, "I know I shall have no pardon, for they shall know no more from me." Anne then maintained her innocence right to the very end. The swordsman then took off his shoes, an act that meant Anne would not hear him approach. Anne then removed her headdress, and her ladies handed her a linen cap. She then tucked her hair inside, so it would not get in the way of the sword. Then, at 9 a.m, the executioner stepped forwards and knelt before Anne. He begged her for forgiveness for what he was about to do, and he then asked Anne to kneel and say her prayers. The crowd then fell to their knees. Anne repeated several times, "To Jesu Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesu, receive my soul." Then, with Anne Boleyn knelt down on the scaffold, the executioner picked up his sword. Anne's eyes were blindfolded, and she said, "Jesu, have pity on my soul." The swordsman then signals to an assistant who makes a noise to distract Anne, and then the executioner, whose hands were trembling with distress, swings his sword twice over his head to gain momentum, and then, with one swift swing, he severs Anne's head. Anne's head then fell to the straw on the scaffold. Horrified eyewitnesses claimed they could see her lips still moving in silent prayer. People began to weep, and the Queen of England was now dead. One of Anne's ladies then bravely picked up her head and covered it with a linen cloth. The other 3 ladies, distressed but refused to let any man touch her, so they picked up her body, and together they carried Anne away. At 9:05, cannons then fire and announced that the Queen of England was dead. Henry heard the cannons and took no time to mourn his loss. Instead, he immediately made his way to the waiting Jane Seymour. At the Tower of London, Anne's body was then laid to rest, but not in a coffin. Instead, Anne's body is placed into an arrow chest, which was taken from the Tower's weaponry. But why did Anne not have a proper coffin? Was it simply due to the lack of time, or was it down to another reason? William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, was responsible for making all the arrangements, but did he, like Anne, believe that Henry would not really go through with it? Anne's body was then taken to the Tower Chapel, where it was stripped of all of her jewellery and expensive yet blood-stained clothes. Incredibly, Anne's clothes and jewels were then to be passed by Henry to his new wife, Anne's replacement, Jane Seymour. Then, at midday, just 3 hours after Anne's execution, she is buried in the chancel next to her brother George. Almost 500 years after her death, Anne is still remembered, and on the anniversary of her death, a bouquet of red roses is left on her grave, a reminder that she is still in the hearts and minds of those she is remembered by. Thomas Cromwell had pulled off a massive coup in executing Anne. He had not only eliminated the Queen of England, but all of her faction as well. Cromwell then went on to be the second most powerful man in England, but no one is safe in the Tudor court, and in a twist of fate he fell from Henry's favour, and 4 years later Thomas Cromwell met the axe. But Anne's already sad story gets worse. After her execution, Henry and Thomas Cromwell tried to erase her from living history. All of her letters, portraits, initials and emblems were destroyed and removed. But no matter how they tried, there was one thing they could not remove. Even though Anne was queen for only 3 years, she left England with one of its greatest legacies. Just 22 years later, against all the odds, her daughter became Queen Elizabeth I, and she ruled for 44 years. And Elizabeth never forgot her mother. She wore a ring with a great secret. Inside this ring was 2 portraits. On one side was Anne Boleyn, and the other, Elizabeth. A tiny yet intricate devotion to her mother. A ring that was only taken off on the deathbed of Elizabeth. And the ring was made from mother of pearl, an illustration of her love for her mother. When you strip back all of the lies and rumours that have surrounded Anne for the past 500 years, you see how groundless the claims were, and you realise that Anne was courageous and brave throughout the scariest part of her life. Henry then, just 11 days after the execution of Anne, married Jane Seymour. And Cromwell, after Anne's execution, declared that just 12 days before her death, he had feigned an illness and retired from court to plot her downfall. It took just 1 month for him to bring down the Queen of England. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.